Good morning, everyone, and welcome. So very glad you're here. Let me make some preliminary remarks before our speaker comes to the podium. For those of you who are visiting with us, we welcome you to All Saints Church. We have red welcome bags available to you on the lawn so that you could get to know All Saints better. Those contain brochures describing all the different ministries of All Saints Church. And today at All Saints, we, like every other day, we take action on our faith. And today's actions are twofold. They have to do with gun violence, because that's the focus of our presentation today. So there are people who will be at this table, this action table, to help you get educated about what those two bills are, and also so that you can participate in some very appropriate political action today. We always love having the financial support of those people who are here. If you are not a regular pledger of All Saints Church, we depend on your generosity to make events like this take place. Finally, before our introduction, if you would like to be on an email blast that I send every Thursday, telling everyone what we're going to be doing in this room, I would really love to have you sign up for that. And there are also clipboards there. You would find a green piece of paper, the one that has the green pieces of paper in it, and give us your name and contact information if you'd like to be on that mailing list. Many of you know that gun violence prevention is one of the 6 agenda items of the Peace and Justice agenda at All Saints Church, and we are very, very excited that we have a quite effective task force working on that. I'd like to introduce to you the members of the task force so that they can stand if they're here in the room. We are thrilled that more and more people want to be engaged in our work because we are trying to bring sanity to the gun situation in America, and also to see our gun proliferation as a public health issue. So I'd like for these people to stand. Dan Carrillo, please stand. Judith Carter, is she here? Didn't see her earlier. Virginia Classic, Linda McGarrian, and Sandy Paget. Upstairs, they're upstairs. Very good. You can learn more about their work and sign up to be on their mailing list when you stop by this action table today and participate in our letter writing effort on those two important California bills related to guns. The mission of this group is to educate, advocate, and organize to prevent gun violence and to respond to the impact of gun violence. Through sustained action in partnership with advocacy groups, elected officials, schools, children, youth, families, public safety, public health officials, and interfaith leaders. And our vision is we create communities that are peaceful, safe, and secure, where people do not live in fear of the impact of gun violence, and we protect the sacredness of every human being. Please join us in this very important work. Now, a few words about our speaker. He's long been one of California's leading lawyers and lawmakers. Now, as LA's chief lawyer and prosecutor, he has brought an innovative and problem-solving focus to the office. A leader in preventing gun violence, Mike Feuer created a gun violence prevention unit in his office and has worked aggressively to keep guns out of the hands of children. Working with the Los Angeles Police Department, he created protocols to assure domestic violence perpetrators do not have weapons. In a groundbreaking national effort, he joined with Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr. to co-found and chair Prosecutors Against Gun Violence, an independent, nonpartisan coalition devoted to prosecutorial and policy solutions to the public health and safety crisis of gun violence. He previously served as the majority policy leader of the California Assembly and chair of the Assembly's Judiciary Committee, writing many of California's most important public safety and children's health laws. And when he was a Los Angeles City Council member, he wrote some of America's toughest laws to curb gun violence. He has taught at the UCLA School of Law, the UCLA School of Public Affairs. He practiced law at two prominent firms, Huffstetler, Miller, Carlson, and Beardsley and Morrison and Forster. Served as executive director of the Betzedek Legal Services, one of the nation's leading public interest law firms, and was a commentator on NPR member station KPCC. He and his wife, Gail, have been married 31 years and have two children, Aaron and Danielle. And I see that Sandy Paget has come in the room. If you'd just raise your hand, another member of our task force. Will you please, and I want to welcome everybody who's streaming. This is a kind of a growing phenomenon that we don't keep in mind all the time, but there's a camera here, and that oftentimes means at least 100 or 125 individual discrete computers. We don't know how many people are gathered around those computer screens, both in 35 different states and countries as far away as Moldova. So we welcome all of you who are streaming, and we appreciate everybody who's tweeting about Mike's presence here. Will you please warmly join me in welcoming Mike Feuer. Welcome, friend.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So glad to be here.
Thank you so much. All Saints has such a remarkable tradition, not only of faith leadership, but of social action and the pursuit of social justice. It is wonderful to be with you this morning. Of all mornings, you know, I was asking my wife how we would spend Mother's Day, and both our mothers are going to be celebrating with us a little bit later. And we planned our day around this. I said to my wife, as a Jewish guy, where should I be? I should be at church on Sunday. So it's a pleasure to be with you. Any conversion opportunities I will listen to faithfully. All right. I heard an amen over here. I heard an advertisement for Bob Carlson over here. We're just one big happy family this morning, here and in Moldova, apparently. Okay. So what I wanted to begin with is to be sure to invite you to have this be a conversation, not a lecture from me. The format is supposed to be I talk and then we take some questions, but if you have questions or comments you'd like to offer in the midst of my presentation, I will at least give the appearance of acknowledging those questions and comments. But seriously, let's make this more of a conversation this morning. It is a very familial atmosphere here, and it's a pleasure to join you. So the issue of gun violence is a very personal issue for me, and it should be a much more personal issue throughout our region, our state, and our nation. And I think one of the most effective ways to begin to grapple with the public health and safety issue of gun violence is to personalize it a little bit and then talk in very specific and data-based terms as to what the prescriptions ought to be. So, as a personal matter, I was on the Los Angeles City Council in 1999. You might remember the North Valley Jewish Community Center shootings took place in that year. How many of you recall that event? So my daughter was 5 at the time. My son was 7. My daughter was enrolled at another Jewish Community Center summer program on that day in August. And we got word of the shootings beginning to take place by a man with lots of weapons and ammunition, racist and anti-Semitic, committed to kill people that day. I made sure that my own child was safe and secure because we didn't know if this was an issue of just one location or something that was targeting centers throughout our area. She was fine. And then I raced out to the center. It wasn't in my council district, but it was something I wanted to do. And I got to the location. And you know, as an elected official in such a situation, there's really very little roadmap for how to proceed because the police are on the scene. There's a lot happening. What would I do? I learned when I arrived that a young man, 5 years old, the same age as my daughter, had been shot and was taken to the hospital. I decided to go to that hospital and sit with his parents in a waiting room that was just a little tiny space We sat waiting to see if he would survive. When that is the context through which we view the issue of gun violence, how can it help but be personal to all of us? It turns out that young man did survive, and I will tell you, as I recounted the other day in another conversation, kind of an extraordinary thing. I was running for the job I've occupied now for the past couple years, and I was in a living room in the San Fernando Valley giving a talk, kind of a small group, about the issues I cared about, including gun violence. I mentioned this story, and the host of that evening said, "You will not believe it, but the mom who was in that room with you 14 years ago is seated on that couch next to you." I hadn't seen her in 14 years. And her name is Ms. Kadish. Eleanor and Chuck Kadish are the parents of Ben Kadish, who was the young man who was shot, who's now a college student. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary. Life can be so fragile, and in a moment it can turn on a dime. In that moment, for the Kadish family, their lives changed forever, and they have become ardent advocates for common sense rules regarding gun violence. And that's the terminology, that we tend to use, and it sounds a little sanitized when we frame it that way. Let's talk about what we really mean. In a sentence, we should all be focused on keeping guns out of the hands of criminals and kids. That should be our focus. And if we can keep our eye on that ball, riveted on that goal, there is room for common ground, even on an issue so controversial that appears to be destined to be an example of the partisan gridlock in Washington. But there's a great deal we can do as a practical matter here, as a legislative matter from Los Angeles to Sacramento to Washington, D.C. Let's talk about it a little bit. It was mentioned that I reached out to the DA of Manhattan on this issue, and here's why. As a lawmaker in Sacramento and on the city council, I know that it is one thing for those who oppose such rules to rather easily swipe aside, to dismiss voices that they consider not very knowledgeable about public safety issues as being uninformed, too ideological, but it is almost impossible for any lawmaker to dismiss the voice of prosecutors. I am now the chief prosecutor for the city of Los Angeles. Cyrus Vance Jr. is the chief prosecutor for Manhattan. I called him and I said, why don't we join together and create the first ever national coalition of prosecutors devoted to preventing gun violence. Let's draw from each region of our nation, Republican and Democrat, because in each of our jurisdictions, surely we can agree that there's too much gun violence. And he readily agreed to do this, and that was it wasn't even a year ago, about 9 months ago, and it's been remarkable. Already we have 36 of the leading prosecutors in the country, representing a huge swath of our population, who've joined in the first ever summit of prosecutors focused on this issue, purposely in Atlanta, Georgia, a state that is not known for having a lot of these rules in place, but a courageous district attorney who decided to host us in Atlanta. We just in the month of March, we had the second of our summits on the issue of mental health and its nexus to gun violence. We'll be in Portland, Oregon in the fall, talking about domestic violence and gun violence. And here are the kinds of steps we are taking with each other. We're not only focused on legislation, I'll get to that in a second, but we're focused on sharing best practices in our jurisdictions. And it was mentioned earlier that we have some of those practices in place here. And one of those is to be sure we do everything we can to keep guns away from schools and other sites where kids are located. Early on in my tenure, it was mentioned we created this new unit to take action on gun violence prevention. Our office hasn't had such a unit before, but now it's a powerful tool. So for instance, kids sometimes get access to their parents' weapons. Everyone in this room has a role to play on that issue because some of you may have weapons in your houses. I don't think one should be focused on confiscating those weapons. That's not the point. The point is be sure that they are stored safely. Others of you have friends or neighbors who have weapons. You might suggest to them that the safe storage of guns should be a priority for all of us. You have trigger locks that are available in the back of the room. So we have identified this as an issue because both as a prosecutorial matter and, more importantly, as a public education matter, there is not enough universal acceptance of this principle, apparently, and people don't always lock up their guns. So, 9-year-old boy brings a semi-automatic gun to his elementary school with 11 rounds of ammunition. Not something that any of us should tolerate. A high school student, a young man goes to his school having had an altercation with another student the day before, and he tells one of his friends, turns out to be a very brave young woman, that he has that gun with him after having had that disagreement the day before. It takes her a couple hours to muster the courage to tell the authorities in the school that this young man has this weapon and ammunition on their campus, and this is a recipe for disaster. Intervention happens at just the right time. There have been 3 instances already in my administration where we have prosecuted adults who don't safely store their guns. And the first of those instances elicited a very strong reaction from one of the gun lobby's most active advocates here, suggesting that this was being too tough on the people whose weapons had been taken from them, from their houses, by kids. I don't think so. How much better it is to prevent that tragic event from happening in the first place. So we prosecute and publicize the fact we're prosecuting for a very important reason. Not to be punitive. Being punitive for its own sake is not my goal in anything we do. It's to solve a problem. And in this case, to announce to the community that we are going to take every action we can to prevent young children from having access to weapons is ideally a call to action for all of us, to start to educate each other and prevent these tragedies from ever taking place. So let's go a little deeper and talk about some of the issues that are of national significance. Our group, our Prosecutors Against Gun Violence group, just announced this week the opposition of a majority of our members to legislation pending in the U.S. Senate. It's legislation that would require every jurisdiction to accept as a given the concealed weapons rules of other jurisdictions when someone from that jurisdiction comes to California. Vermont has no rules, for example, to restrict the concealed carrying of weapons. A Vermont resident comes to California with a weapon, this legislation would require us to say that's just fine. The same people who advocate for states' rights to assure local control are people who are now saying, well, except for this. Not so good. So our group decided to oppose that legislation, which is being authored by a senator named John Cornyn from Texas. We also chose to support legislation that is jointly authored by Senator Feinstein and a Republican from New York, Representative Peter King. That's legislation pending right now that would add to the list of people prohibited to have weapons in this nation, those on terrorist watch lists. Seems like a pretty common sense thing, right? But at this moment, people on such lists are not prohibited, put another way, they're permitted to buy guns. How can that be? Did you hear the news this morning of hundreds, but the FBI thinks hundreds of adherents to the tenets of ISIS in this country being encouraged by ISIS to take whatever violent action they can on the streets of the United States? And at the same time, it is lawful for people on terrorist watch lists to purchase weapons? How can that be? These ought to be least common denominator issues. There should be common ground across a broad ideological spectrum that we ought to be supporting the kinds of laws that Senator Feinstein and Representative King have authored, and ought to be opposing the kind of legislation that Senator Cornyn has authored. Not yet. And I want to say something to you. I'm always a very direct person. If you are in this room as an advocate for trying to encourage the development of common sense rules, let's recognize a fact. There was a piece in the New York Times not long ago that pointed out that if measured by at least this metric, the National Rifle Association, with whom we should have common ground on these issues, has been able to succeed in a narrative. And the narrative is, we don't need more laws, gun rights matter more. Polls show now that the prevalent, I think like 53% of Americans polled on this issue, weigh the importance of gun rights more heavily than the importance of common sense rules to restrict where guns can be and who can have access to them. That narrative needs to change. Again, not because there should be a call in this country to confiscate people's weapons. That is not anybody's mission as far as I know. But because the lawful possession of weapons carries with it responsibilities like safe storage, and because no one should be sanguine about the fact that there are large swaths of our community who still live with gun violence on their streets every day. There are too many weapons in the hands of criminals and children. So let me talk about that. I'm in a religious institution this morning. I was in another church perhaps 2 years ago. In the brief period between my election and my taking office, I was asked to attend a church south of downtown with an enormous congregation. They had services at 8 and 11. They wanted me to speak at each service about gun violence issues. And I asked the congregation in each instance if it would rise, if its members would rise, if their lives had been touched by gun violence. If I asked that question in this room, I wager that a small number of hands would come up. In that congregation, of the 3,000 people or so who I estimate attended those services, 1,500 stood up. I was at Dorsey High School with Mayor Garcetti in the wake of the George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin issue. And we were before a number of students, perhaps 150 students. I asked them the same question, and about 80% of those kids raised their hands. Their lives had been directly touched by gun violence. This is a continuing crisis for all of us. And I have to say, when it is acceptable in large swaths of our community to ignore this issue, we've lost something. We are in this together. We need to recognize that when anyone in our community is diminished by an issue like this, something is taken from all of us. And each of us has a responsibility to stand up and say so, and then take action like this church and its action team have shown can happen. So I've spoken for a while. No one has interrupted me. Your manners are terrible. And although I think I got an email from someone in Moldova as we were talking, I would encourage this to be much more of a dialogue. When I worked at Bob Carlson's law firm, he was not shy about telling me to do stuff. So I would like to ask you to please engage me a little bit about this issue in any manner you'd like. Challenge what I've said, ask questions. Otherwise, I'll continue speaking for a while. Please.
So let's give the microphones to people so that those who are streaming can hear. If you'll hold your hand up, we'll get a microphone. There's one over there, ready to go, and one right here, ready to go. So please.
Sir.
Mike, Chuck Pereira. I worked with Jim Clark from your office years ago.
Yes, it's good to see you.
But I'm wondering what jurisdiction your office has on gun control issues compared to, say, the District Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, the United States Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, and how you all coordinate with each other in these efforts.
It's a great question. So first, our office has, as a prosecutorial matter, authority over misdemeanors. Basically said, our authority is misdemeanors and the district attorney's authority is felonies. But about 70% of the crimes we ultimately prosecute as misdemeanors were initially charged as felonies. So these are often serious issues. And the issues we've been discussing today are all within my jurisdiction. Obviously, we were actively involved in them. But then you've asked a deeper and really important question. It goes to the heart of one of the aspects of my job that I think is most important. Typically, elected officials will say, well, my jurisdiction is X and I can't be involved with others. And I think that is the antithesis of good government. You don't care whose authority it is on a given problem. You just want the problem solved. And so that cross-jurisdictional collaboration is essential. Most of the members of Prosecutors Against Gun Violence, almost all of them, are district attorneys. But we work well. Jackie Lacey, who is our county district attorney, is a member of that team. There are gun violence hotspots in the city of Los Angeles. I am working with the police department right now, and I've spoken to Ms. Lacey, and we've talked to the federal authorities as well about the importance of collaborating to suppress gun violence in specific areas of the city of Los Angeles where suddenly it's erupting. And we're working on that kind of partnership right now. And by the way, those partnerships transcend traditional law enforcement partners and need to relate, among others, to the faith community. You know, I grew up in San Bernardino. I was kidding about my faith earlier, but when I grew up, you know, the Six-Day War broke out in 1967. I was 8. I was in 3rd grade, and the teacher turned to me and said, "Would you please explain the Jewish perspective on the Six-Day War to the class?" And yeah, and you know, I was 8, so I did that. But but the point is, I grew up in a community where sometimes, you know, I developed pretty strong views about the separation of church and state because I knew what it felt like to be in a very, very small minority in that setting. But my views when it comes to issues like this have evolved dramatically. And I think that we ought to be actively engaging as people in government, members of, leaders of the faith community, to participate with us. I gave an example the other day, and again, this goes beyond your question, but to talk about partnerships. There's a program in San Bernardino that we're trying to begin to model here where faith leaders are on school campuses. And they're there because some of their congregants are there too. And some of those congregants, it is thought, would be less inclined to engage in acts of violence when clergy are around. And I think there are elements of that program and others from which we could benefit, especially when we talk about regions where gun violence is erupting on a given moment. So on one hand, yes, there are rigid demarcations between the city attorney and the DEA when it comes to the crimes that we prosecute. But those demarcations ought to melt away when trying to grapple with a problem that we share in common, not only on the ground, but also when it comes to advocating for legislative change. Over here.
Steve?
Thank you for being with us this morning.
Good to be here.
The NRA takes money from gun manufacturers and uses it to oppose gun control, public safety measures all over the country. And its tentacles reach everywhere, similar to a racketeering organization. Is there any way you could see that the NRA could be prosecuted under RICO for being a racketeering organization?
Like I said, I encourage provocative conversation.
Welcome to All Saints.
That's right. It's a great question. I haven't thought of that, and I will, but let me say, it'll be a springboard. The short answer is I don't know. But the larger question is, should we continue to accept the paradigm of us against them when it comes to this issue? And it's hard not to on some levels because the NRA was so successful, for example, in preventing from being enacted universal background checks in the wake of the Newtown tragedy, when 90% of the country favored it and not a majority of the U.S. Senate seemed prepared to have the courage to listen to what 90% believed ought to happen. But having said that, at our last Prosecutors Against Gun Violence conference on the nexus between mental illness and gun violence, we invited the immediate past president of the NRA to join us, and he did. Because I think on issues like that, there could be common ground. And in that moment, I actually asked him as a panelist, having just seen a presentation from another organization about principles that could guide improvements in law on mental illness and gun violence, if he would join us in together promoting those changes. And the answer was not no. It wasn't a firm yes either, but it opened the door to a conversation. And so on the one hand, while I have had personal experience of being on the other side of the gun industry on key legislative issues, and it has been often a very tenacious battle, it's also true that if we resign ourselves to thinking that there's never going to be common ground on these issues, I think we lose something. So I'm trying to kind of navigate those waters, and it's not an easy navigation to perform, but we're trying. Having said that, I mean, I'm also very real about it. I wrote California's law requiring the microstamping of handguns. Here's what that means. When the weapon is fired, there's a little explosion inside the barrel of the gun. There is a casing, a cartridge in which the bullet is housed. During that moment, when you pull the trigger, that casing comes in contact with the interior of the weapon. Microstamping means imprinting a laser code into the barrel of the gun or locations within the gun on the firing pin or elsewhere, such that when an explosion takes place, the shell casing has stamped on it code for the make, model, and serial number of the weapon. I had the support of more than 65 police chiefs and sheriffs around the state, including the Police Chiefs Association, when we were able to get that bill signed by Governor Schwarzenegger, because it provides law enforcement with leads when the shell casing at a scene of the crime tells you who bought the gun. That's what this legislation would effectively do. So just a brief story about that to give you a sense of the rough and tumble of this. So the law passes. The Senate had put into my bill a provision that said there had to be no patent restrictions on the technology, so no individual could benefit financially from the rule. Fine, the Attorney General had to certify that those patent restrictions didn't exist. So we go through the process, and the inventor is actually a former NRA member from the East Coast, and because he believes that we should take steps to help law enforcement. So he's trying to give up the patents on this. He actually hires people to help him give up what would be otherwise economically beneficial to him. And the gun lobby in California has a representative that actually purchases the patents as he's trying to get rid of them to try to thwart the effectiveness of the law. And now the gun industry has filed suit in federal and state court. They lost in federal court. The state suit is pending to try to prevent the law that I wrote from taking effect. It is now in effect. So I don't want to sound as though I'm naive about the cross currents here. There is real tension in people's perspectives on this issue. But I am a huge believer as an elected official, as a leader here in our region, and I hope beyond, in trying to find ways to listen carefully to everyone's perspective and trying to see if we can work together on at least a sliver of an issue.
Mike, while the mic's going to somebody else, let me pose two questions to you, please. You mentioned mental health and that you and the other prosecutors are concerned about that. I was very interested in the gun buyback or gun turn-in program yesterday in the city, how one daughter, an adult daughter, had brought all of the guns of her gun collector father and turned them all in because he has Alzheimer's. And all of the SIBs were concerned about accidents. So you mentioned two pieces of legislation, one you're against and one you're in favor of. Is there any legislation that we need to keep an eye on coming up having to do with the issue of mental illness?
So there was recently enacted in the wake of the tragedy in Isla Vista. And by the way, how many times do we have to talk about actions taken in the wake of the tragedy in X, right? And, you know, some of us have been working, and your church leaders have been working to try to prevent altogether that tragedy in the first place. Reacting to a tragedy is the worst kind of government. Preventing, being ahead of the curve, is the best, right? But in the wake of the Isla Vista shooting, our legislature adopted a new rule that allows people to seek what's called a gun violence restraining order. And the idea is one can go to court if one is concerned about a friend or a family member or someone else in the community who is potentially someone with serious mental issues, mental health issues. One can go to court and say, until that person's problems have been cleared up, no weapon, please. And a court is empowered to say no weapons during the pendency of that time. You know, it's easy for us often, I think our society generally has had a very difficult time grappling with issues of mental health and often demonizes people in ways that are inappropriate. But by the same token, there are also moments when we say, okay, we want you to recover, we want you to have the tools necessary to recover, but by the way, during that period, a weapon, not a good thing. And so we have that rule in place now. There may be other approaches. Our group is actually literally in the process now of trying to identify some approaches that we think might improve our system. I'm not ready to talk about them yet because we're still in process. Yes?
Okay. Thank you for coming and welcome. All right. I was a victim of a home invasion robbery. And the police told me the young man who fired the gun was probably not a criminal, but was in fact, this was a gang-related initiation or something like that. What can be done in gang programs to try to maybe educate the young gang members about the victims and what happens to the victims?
You know, the issue of the tether between gang activity and gun violence is a very important issue. I'm not sure that education is always going to be the most effective answer in that environment. The most effective strategies are ones that take a long time and require resources that we've been reluctant to allocate to the problem, and that is gang activity in the first place needs to be interrupted by a whole different approach in our schools and in our homes. We're working, for example, on a relationship that is very rarely talked about, and that is between domestic violence and gang violence. Kids who are growing up in locations where there's lots of trauma, kids who grew up in families that are riven with tension, are kids who are looking for an alternative place to be accepted, for people to look up to. We need to be, far before someone is in a gang with a weapon, we need to be interrupting that cycle that leads kids to be involved in gangs in the first place. I have a lot to say about the issue of gangs and guns. It's a longer conversation, but suffice it to say that I think our best attention is focused on preventing gang involvement in the first place, which is, by the way, much less expensive as a societal matter than trying to deal with intervening with gang members later on.
Yes, hello. In the news now are these reports from Texas and I think something like 5 states in the Southwest where the Army is conducting training exercises. And at least in Texas, there are vigilantes and gun-bearing people who are arming themselves and buying more guns in fear of government taking over their states or over their places to live. Can you comment on that, this kind of fear of government that makes people want to have guns?
You know, I'm not sure what to say about that exactly, because as I think in some ways the antidote to that is some restrictions on the purchase of weapons that don't exist in other jurisdictions. Because the attitude that leads one to be resentful or fearful of government, I'm not going to be able to interrupt that. So for example, when I was a city councilman here in Los Angeles, I was able to author legislation to preclude one from buying more than a single weapon in a given month. Now, you say, well, who needs 12 guns a year? But that was not the theory of the legislation. A very frequent way that gang members and other criminals get access to guns is through straw purchasers, people who are lawfully permitted to obtain weapons, who walk into a store, buy them in bulk, and resell them on the street. So if one cannot purchase more than a single weapon in a given month, one can't make a living running guns. And we adopted that here, and I worked very closely with then Assemblyman Wally Knox in the state legislature, who used our legislation as a catalyst to make that the rule at the state level. And so I'd like to see common sense rules like that adopted on a more broad basis. And that lesson, by the way, that catalytic impact of what we did here on state law change is a lesson that shouldn't be lost on anybody in this room. As you work as local leaders on issues of gun violence, be they practical lessons on the street or education programs or advocating for bills, that can propel action at other levels of either in government locally to the state and sometimes at the federal level. And I want people to feel that sense of efficacy. That's one of the keys to being an activist, is feeling like what you are doing can have a real impact. And one goal of my presence today is that you leave here feeling that each of you can, in fact, have a substantial and meaningful impact on this issue. That sense of efficacy, I think, can work to all of our benefits. Now.
Hi, thanks for coming today. I'm wondering if you are aware of either interfaith or interpolitical efforts for people to get together and share their stories about how they've been affected by gun violence, and especially people from, all different perspectives, because I think that's an effective strategy.
I'm aware of some organizations that have created that space. For example, Women Against Gun Violence is an organization that does that in our region. I'm not armed with an array of other organizations that do that, but I think that's an important thing to do. I am less a fan of a single day of discussion than I am of concerted activity toward common goals that last for a long period of time. But there needs to be some better listening on this issue. And I think from the voices of people who have been affected by gun violence can come some of the most compelling reasons for others to get involved.
You got one more.
Okay.
If you could turn this on. Could I just interject? I met Mike last week, Sandy Pageant, as part of the task force here at All Saints. We went to a conference that was sponsored by the Los Angeles Metropolitan Churches and was represented by, 15 different churches, something like that. So there are efforts being made in that kind of collaboration, and we should do more here locally for that. Here's a question.
Yes, you mentioned that the key is to stay ahead of the curve in all of this. And I'm aware of all of the kind of liability approaches, people misusing product and it kind of failing that way. And I see another bump on the road coming down with the 3D printers, with the people that are going to be able to distribute programs that allow people to make guns on their own, bypassing any sort of registration at all. Is there any look towards how to deal with that? I've seen some dramas where people have been taking people to court who distributed the programs, and at least in the dramas, they've failed to make the connection at this point.
Yeah, do you know what's your first name? You know what Bill is talking about? So the idea that there are these printers now that, through a program that can be easily obtained from the internet, enable the one who's using the printer to create all kinds of three-dimensional devices, including guns. And those devices are often not detectable by our traditional means. So, for example, a 3D plastic gun may not be detectable at an airport. So there was federal legislation that was recently renewed that makes that unlawful, to have a 3D printer that creates a weapon that is undetectable at an airport. But the actual ability to enforce rules like that, very difficult in a world where the internet is now a pervasive thing. I don't have an easy answer, but obviously, as you can tell from my response to you, it's a vexing question that is very much on my mind. Because there are all kinds of sort of free First Amendment issues associated with the transmission of those programs. And at the same time, they come headlong into the real world of public safety. I don't think any of us wants to have guns that cannot be detected through metal detectors, for example. That would be a pretty bad thing. But that is on the horizon. So no easy answer. It's something we need to be working on. I don't have enough expertise to tell you exactly what the antidote to that problem is, but you raise a point that I share, a concern I share.
Mike, let me wrap up. Oh, sure. You've had your hand up so much. Can we get a mic to this brother right here?
You mentioned earlier
It's just not going to transmit to our streaming.
okay. You mentioned earlier the search for a sliver of collaboration
Yes.
with the NRA. Have you found any slivers?
Well, it's a great question. I am optimistic, cautiously, that issues around mental illness and gun violence can create that opportunity. And, in so many areas, all of us know from our personal experience, if you find working with someone who could be your adversary, if you find an opportunity to have one success, that creates a little bit of trust that could spur momentum to another success. And I am hopeful that that is the window through which we can start to do that. I think that of all the issues, there is at least there are at least words from the gun advocacy world being focused on how to deter people who have serious mental illness from having access to guns. So that's where I hope it begins, but I haven't seen solid evidence of that collaboration emerging yet. But I think that our organization, our prosecutors' organization, might just be the team to facilitate that because, again, we have prosecutors. It's an amazing thing. We started this from nothing, and you would think, okay, well, prosecutors from New York or San Francisco or Seattle or LA would be involved. Yeah, and prosecutors from Houston and Baton Rouge and Charlotte Mecklenburg and Atlanta and so forth are also involved with us. I know that I can tell the hour is nigh, as we say. We're at the conclusion of our discussion. But may I just say it is a privilege to have an opportunity to engage with a community that is both so thoughtful on the one hand and at the same time prepared to translate those thoughts and that vision into action. I wish there were more congregations like yours, and I hope we can find ways to be active partners as the years go on. Thank you very much.
Let me recap. And we'll have one more opportunity to applaud Mike. First, I want to thank you. I mean, there are a million places you could be on Mother's Day other than All Saints Church, and I really appreciate your being here, Mike. I do want you to visit the action table. We have legislation that is in the state legislature, and we'd like for you to establish a kind of a steamrolling effect to help us with gun violence control. And it's really great to have a relationship with you, Mike, between All Saints and you. We established a wonderful working relationship with Jackie Lacey around Proposition 47. It'd be great to have you come back and talk about mass incarceration, which is another one of our really important issues. So will you please again thank Mike Feuer.